In the winter of 1864, the town of Belrose, Louisiana, held its final slave auction. The war was ending. The Confederacy was collapsing. And yet, one man, a plantation owner named Elias Granger, came to buy what everyone else feared to touch. They said she was the last one. A woman dressed in white, standing perfectly still beneath the oak tree where the others had been sold. The crowd murmured that her name had been scratched out of the ledger, that she hadn't spoken in days. When the auctioneer tried to start the bidding, no one raised a hand. No one even looked up. They claimed her eyes, though half closed, made them remember things they'd buried for years, things they swore had never happened. But Elias Granger was a proud man. He stepped forward, offered $10, and ended the silence. That night, the townsfolk said they heard a woman humming from his wagon all the way down the road, a sound halfway between a prayer and a warning. The Granger plantation had survived every storm, war, plague, and ruin. Elias inherited it from a father who believed the land itself was holy, that it gave and took life as it pleased. By 1864, the mansion stood like a monument to something long dead. The windows were nailed shut, the mirrors draped. The hallways smelled faintly of lamp oil and damp linen. Servants had either fled or disappeared into the cane fields. When Elias brought the woman home, the remaining housekeeper, old Martha, refused to let her cross the threshold. "She don't belong in this house, sir," Martha whispered. Elias smiled coldly. "Neither do you, Martha. But here we are." The woman never spoke. She moved with slow, deliberate grace, as if she were walking through water. Elias gave her a small room near the servants' quarters, locked each night for her safety, and left her with food she never touched. The next morning, the dogs were found dead by the fence line. No marks, no blood, just stillness. The same stillness that followed her wherever she went. Elias began writing in his father's old ledger again, the one that recorded property, crop yields, and the names of the enslaved. His handwriting trembled as he wrote her down as female, approximate, 30, silent. But something was wrong. Each morning, the ink would blur. The words would slide across the page as if the paper itself was trying to erase her. He blamed the humidity, the candle smoke, anything but his own shaking hand. At night, Elias dreamed of his father, the elder Granger, standing by the same oak tree where the auctions had been held. But in the dream, the tree was empty. No ropes, no people, just the sound of wind whistling through hollow wood. He'd wake to find the woman standing by his door, her eyes half open, her lips moving without sound. When he confronted her, she simply turned and walked back into the dark. He began locking his own bedroom door at night. Belrose was a town built on forgetting. Its church still preached the same sermons it had before the war: sin, obedience, salvation, but no one mentioned the years of blood and chains. When Elias rode into town, the people crossed the street to avoid him. They said he had gone too far, buying what others had left behind. The local preacher, Father Harrow, visited the plantation once. He told Elias that forgiveness required confession, that something buried could not be blessed. Elias told him to mind his own fields. Harrow left, pale and sweating. Days later, his church bell cracked down the middle. Meanwhile, the woman in white began appearing at the edge of town, standing by the riverbank, watching. Children who saw her said she mouthed their names. Adults dismissed it as nonsense. But the dream spread. First Elias, then his neighbors, then the whole of Belrose. They dreamed of a quiet woman standing by a tree that was no longer there. By the end of the second week, Elias had stopped sleeping. He couldn't explain why the house felt smaller, why the walls seemed to hum when she walked past. He tried to sell her back, to anyone, but the auction block in Belrose was gone, torn down, replaced by a patch of grass and silence. Desperate, he turned again to his father's ledger. He found entries that shouldn't have been there, names he didn't write, years that didn't exist, notes written in a hand identical to his own. "She remembers what they made her forget." That sentence repeated 6 times across the final page, each time in darker ink. When he tore the page out, he found another beneath it. Same words, same handwriting, but now the paper was damp, as if soaked from beneath by something breathing. Elias burned the book in the hearth that night. But when he woke, it was back on his desk. Open, waiting. Elias began hearing sounds beneath the parlor floor. At first, faint tapping, like someone scratching wood with a nail. He assumed it was rats. But one night, the tapping began to form rhythm. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 knocks. Pause. 1. It was deliberate. He pried the boards open and found nothing but soil. Yet the sound continued, from inside the walls now. From under the bed. From inside the fire grate. The woman in white never reacted. She simply sat by the window, hands folded, staring toward the fields. When he shouted at her to speak, she turned slowly, eyes half-glazed, and whispered her first words since the auction. "They are under the house, Mr. Granger. All of them." Elias struck her in fear, denying what he heard. But that night, when he walked past the cellar, he swore he heard breathing, not one, but dozens, rising through the floorboards like the wind. The next morning, the air smelled of iron and wet earth. A storm was coming. Elias found muddy footprints in the hallway, small, bare, leading from the woman's room to the locked door of the study. The ledger was open again. The ink hadn't dried. It glistened wet and dark, as though written moments ago. On the last page, beneath the words he thought he burned, was a new line. "You paid for her. Now she remembers you." He slammed the book shut. Outside, thunder rolled over the fields, bending the cane like kneeling figures. Elias saw shapes moving in the rows, silhouettes swaying in unison, faces turned upward as if waiting for rain that would never fall. When lightning flashed, they vanished. Inside, the woman was humming again, the same broken tune the townsfolk heard on auction day. Only this time, Elias realized she was humming the melody to his mother's favorite hymn, a hymn no one had sung since she died in that very house. Sleep came rarely now. When it did, it brought visions that didn't belong to him. He saw a field of faces, their eyes reflecting torchlight. He smelled sweat, iron, and tobacco. Heard laughter, his father's voice, young and cruel. Then screaming. Elias woke drenched in sweat, fingernails bloody from clawing the bedpost. On his wrists were faint impressions, rope marks. He began finding objects he didn't recognize. A child's shoe under the dresser, a silver cross missing its chain, a key rusted black from age. All smelled faintly of rain and ash. Martha, the old housekeeper, tried to intervene. "Sir, this place ain't right. You're hearing the house talk back to you." He fired her on the spot. But when he went to bed that night, he heard Martha's voice outside his window, whispering a prayer, her words trembling through the glass. The next morning, she was gone. Only her shawl remained, draped neatly over the gatepost. Elias began talking aloud to the woman, as if to test his sanity. He asked her who she was. She didn't answer. He asked where she came from. Still silence. But when he asked what she wanted, her head tilted slightly, as though the question had weight. Finally, she whispered, "I want what you forgot." Her words crawled into his thoughts, echoing even when she wasn't there. He tried reading his father's letters, searching for reason, but the ink on those too had begun to fade, leaving only fragments. Trial beneath the house. Remove their tongues. For the sake of silence. He realized with horror that the plantation wasn't just built on soil. It was built on graves, graves no one recorded, because they had never been meant to be remembered. That night, Elias brought a chair to the basement and sat there for hours, waiting for the knocking to start again. When it did, it was directly beneath his feet. Elias descended into the cellar for the first time since childhood. The air was damp, heavy with rot. His lantern flickered as he followed the sound, steady, rhythmic, pulling him deeper. At the far wall, beneath layers of plaster and age, he saw it. A door. Small. Iron. Bolted shut from the outside. He didn't remember it ever being there. He knelt and brushed away dust. Someone had carved words into the wood, shallow and uneven. "Forget us not." He stepped back, trembling. The woman appeared behind him in silence, her presence cold as the cellar air. She looked at the door, then at him. "You can't keep them buried," she said. "You were there too." He screamed that she was lying, that he was a child when the slaves were punished, that he'd never taken part. But she only smiled faintly. "Memory doesn't care what age you were, Mr. Granger. It only cares that you watched." Elias relit the lantern. Its light trembled, throwing warped shadows against the cellar walls. The woman was gone, as though she had never stood there at all. He stared again at the door. The words "forget us not" seemed deeper now, almost fresh. He pressed his palm against the metal bolt, and for a moment, it felt warm. He stumbled back upstairs, shaking. The moment he reached the hallway, the scent of lamp oil grew thick, suffocating. He turned toward the parlor and froze. Every mirror in the house had been uncovered. Not by him. In the flickering light, each reflection showed something different. A banquet table crowded with pale faces, a child hiding beneath it, hands clutching her ears, a noose swaying in a corner, a ledger open and burning but never consumed. He tried smashing the mirrors, but each time glass shattered, another one somewhere else in the house revealed itself, clean and whole again. The next morning, Elias found himself standing in a room he didn't remember existing. The walls were lined with portraits, faded, sepia-toned, all of people he didn't recognize, or thought he didn't. He realized the eyes were all familiar. They were the same as hers. The woman in white. The last slave. Her face repeated, generation after generation. Same bone structure. Same expression of quiet defiance. One painting, larger than the rest, bore a date in gold, 1832. The woman in that portrait was smiling faintly, holding a child with Elias's family crest stitched into the blanket. He reached out to touch it, and felt heartbeat through the canvas. When he stumbled back, the lantern fell, spilling light across the frames. Every face turned toward him at once, their painted eyes shifting slightly, following his every breath. Elias rode into Belrose at dawn, desperate for answers. He sought out the town's historian, a frail man named Abel Crane who lived above the old post office. When Elias told him about the auction and the woman, Crane went silent. Then, carefully, he pulled a small, leather-bound book from his shelf, an early census record. There was no record of any last slave ever being sold. In fact, the final auction of Belrose had ended 3 years before the date Elias remembered. Elias demanded explanation. Crane only shook his head. The mind protects itself, he said softly, especially when a man inherits his father's sins. Elias laughed in disbelief, but Crane's eyes didn't move. There was a woman, yes, but she wasn't sold. She was killed by your father. The record says she was pregnant with a child that bore his name. The room spun. Elias dropped the ledger. His hands were shaking. When he looked back up, Crane was gone. The chair was empty. The candle was out. Elias rode back toward the plantation, but the road stretched endlessly. Trees bled together into black silhouettes. His horse grew restless, eyes rolling back, foam at the mouth. Then, the woman appeared in the middle of the road. He pulled the reins hard. The horse reared, throwing him into the mud. When he looked up, she was standing inches away. Her skin was pale from moonlight, her dress soaked in rain. "You went to find truth," she whispered. "But truth was never lost, Elias. It was buried under your name." He screamed for her to leave him, to return to whatever grave she came from. She stepped closer, reaching out her hand. For a moment, he thought he saw kindness in her face. But then he noticed the veins in her wrist pulsed like roots, spreading black beneath the skin. He stumbled back into the mud, trembling. The woman didn't move. By dawn, she was gone. But the road never led him home again, not the way he remembered it. When Elias finally reached the plantation, it was wrong. The porch sagged differently. The shutters hung from hinges that hadn't existed before. Inside, the wallpaper had changed, replaced with a floral pattern his mother once adored. In the parlor, the furniture was arranged as it had been decades earlier, when his father still ruled the house. And sitting in his father's old chair, perfectly still, was the woman in white. "You keep trying to change the house," she said quietly, "but it only remembers the truth." Her voice was calm, but her words carried weight, pressing against the air. Elias dropped to his knees, clutching his head. "Tell me what you want," he cried. She looked at him, pity in her eyes. "I want you to listen." The walls began to creak. The floorboards split open, revealing the faint glimmer of bones below. Not one body. Dozens. Layered like forgotten pages in the story he refused to read. When Elias woke, every clock in the house had stopped. The pendulums hung mid-swing, the gears frozen as though the moment itself refused to move forward. He stood, dizzy, and realized he didn't remember lying down. The light through the window was neither day nor night, a colorless haze that made shadows blur and melt. Down the hallway, the woman's humming drifted again. He followed it, barefoot, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the parlor, the sound stopped, and there, on the table, lay his father's pocket watch. It had no hands, only the faint reflection of his own face etched inside the glass. "Time ended when you bought me," she said softly from behind him. "No," he muttered, turning. "It ended long before that." The walls began to pulse faintly, breathing. With every exhale, dust fell from the ceiling like ashes. Elias stepped outside for the first time in days. The cane fields were overgrown, reaching nearly to his chest. But there were paths cut through them now, narrow trails leading deep into the rows. He followed one, the whisper of stalks brushing against his sleeves. As he walked, voices began to rise, faint and overlapping, not angry but sorrowful, like a congregation murmuring beneath the soil. At the field's heart stood the oak tree, the same tree from his dreams, the one from the auction. He saw rope marks carved into its bark, old, scarred over. The air shimmered around it, as though heat rose from invisible fires. Elias dropped to his knees, trembling. He whispered apologies, though he didn't know to whom. The cane rustled in response, once, twice, then fell perfectly still. When he looked up, the woman was standing beside the tree, watching. "They never wanted revenge," she said. "Only remembrance." He bowed his head and wept. Back inside, the plantation was no longer silent. The knocking from beneath the floor had turned into whispers, indistinct but rhythmic. Elias pressed his ear to the wood and realized they were speaking his name. He fled to the upstairs study and shut the door. On the desk lay the ledger again, open to blank pages. He picked up the pen. His hand moved without command, scrawling lines that weren't words but shapes, spirals, circles, eyes. Then, beneath them, a single phrase appeared in ink darker than black. "The house remembers, so you don't have to." The walls trembled. The chandeliers swayed though there was no wind. Elias backed away, heart pounding. He understood now. The house had never been haunted by her. It was haunted by him. Every brick, every beam, built with silence that demanded voice. Soft whisper, barely audible. "Say it, Elias." Elias entered the old chapel behind the mansion, its doors swollen shut from years of neglect. Inside, pews lay overturned, hymn books scattered and damp. He stood before the pulpit, the wood stained darker than time should allow. On the wall behind it hung a single cross, crooked, splintered. He began to speak aloud, a confession or something like it. He spoke of his father, of the ledger, of the nameless people buried beneath the house. He confessed his inheritance, not in gold, but in silence. As he spoke, dust began to rise from the floor, swirling upward into faint shapes that seemed to breathe. The air thickened until it felt like standing in the eye of a storm. The woman appeared again, seated in the front pew. "You can't pray away memory," she said gently. "Then what am I supposed to do?" "Finish the story." He returned to the cellar one final time. The iron door waited, rust-streaked like veins. The inscription, "Forget US not," glowed faintly in the lantern's reflection. He reached for the bolt. This time, it was cold, lifeless. As he pulled, the sound echoed through the entire house, like a scream muffled by earth. Inside was darkness. Not empty, full, thick, heavy. It moved like smoke. Elias stepped closer. The woman's voice came from within, calm, patient. "You wanted to own what could never be owned. Now you must keep what can never be buried." He fell to his knees, sobbing. The darkness surged forward, swallowing the light, the room, the air. Elias woke to the same storm he had fallen asleep to days before. The same thunderclap, the same dripping roof. He checked the clock, midnight, though the hands had returned. He tried to write, but every word he set down appeared already on the page, as if he were copying a memory instead of recording it. He left the study. Downstairs, the parlor glowed faintly. Voices whispered from the hall, fragments of conversation he remembered from childhood. His father's laughter, the ring of glasses, a girl humming by the piano. He stepped inside. The scene was there, his family alive, frozen mid-gesture like figures trapped in amber. When lightning flashed, they turned their heads toward him all at once. "You've been here before," said the woman's voice, everywhere at once. "I never left," he answered. The lightning went out. The room was empty again. Halfway up the stairs, Elias saw a boy sitting on the steps, knees drawn to his chest. Mud streaked his clothes. His face was familiar, the same gray eyes, the same scar along the jaw. "Who are you?" Elias asked. The boy smiled faintly. You know, you watched. Elias knelt. Watched what? The boy pointed downward, toward the cellar. When they went below, Elias reached for him, but the boy's form blurred like mist. You closed the door, the boy whispered, and you never opened it again. The air thickened. The walls leaned inward. When Elias looked away for a moment, the staircase was empty, but muddy footprints led upward, to his room. On his desk lay a photograph he didn't own, a group portrait taken in front of the plantation decades earlier. Men in suits, women in bonnets, and one figure at the edge, head turned away. Elias lifted it to the light. The woman in white stood behind his father, one hand resting gently on his shoulder. Her eyes looked straight at the lens, straight at him. Behind the photo's paper backing, something rattled. He peeled it open and found a small slip of paper, stained and brittle. A single line in a hand he knew too well. Every picture remembers the moment it was taken. He dropped the photo. It landed face down, but when he turned it over again, the crowd was gone. Only two figures remained, him and her, standing together before an empty field. That night, he dreamed of Belrose alive again. Candles in every window, the square filled with townsfolk dancing. But their faces were blank, featureless, smooth. The woman moved among them in her white dress, carrying a lantern. Wherever its light touched, faces returned. The preacher, the housekeeper, the children by the river. Each turned to him and whispered a single word, remember. He shouted that he did remember, that he'd seen it all. But the music grew louder until it was only thunder, and when the lantern light fell on him, he saw his own face. Older, hollow, wearing the expression of his father. He woke with soot on his hands and the smell of smoke in the room. Elias followed the trail of soot to the east wing, a corridor lined entirely with mirrors. None had been there before. In each reflection, he saw a different version of himself. Child, soldier, overseer, beggar. In every image, the woman stood beside him, expression unchanged. He pressed his hand to one mirror. The glass rippled like water. A voice rose from within, layered and low. The story you refuse to finish will keep repeating itself. He tried to turn away, but every mirror now showed only the door in the cellar. The inscription glowed brighter, flooding the corridor with white light. He closed his eyes. The humming returned, soft, steady, forgiving. The cellar wasn't on any blueprint. Elias found it by accident, a hollow echo beneath the floorboards of the master bedroom. Dust fell like gray rain as he pried open the plank and descended with a lantern. The air was heavy with mildew and an old perfume, faint and human. In the middle of the room stood a mirror, tall, cracked, and framed in oak. But the reflection it gave wasn't his own. It showed the parlor, years ago, full of laughter, whiskey, and servants lined against the wall. The image flickered. The faces in the reflection turned to look at him, one by one, their mouths moving soundlessly, as if rehearsing a word too terrible to speak. When Elias tried to look away, the mirror hissed softly. It wanted him to remember. He began keeping a journal that night, as if logic could trap the irrational. Each page described a new phenomenon. The clock striking 13, the taste of iron in the water, the portraits that bled through their own varnish. Yet when he reread his entries, he found lines he didn't remember writing. She was promised a life, one read, in looping script not his own. They took it and sealed her beneath. Beneath? He circled the word until the paper tore. Outside, the storm had stopped, but the cicadas screamed as though warning him that something below was listening and waiting for him to listen back. In the attic, he found a box of tintypes. All were of the same woman, the one from the mirror, standing before the plantation gates. But in each successive photograph, her posture changed slightly. Her head tilted further downward. Her hands, once folded, began to grip the bars of the iron gate. In the final photo, the gate was open, but the landscape behind her was nothingness. When Elias flipped the photos, he realized they formed a sequence, a story told backward. He wasn't uncovering her. She was uncovering him. The next night, he awoke to singing. Faint, harmonic, almost sacred. He followed it through the corridors, the lantern's flame twitching like a frightened eye. The music came from the chapel, a ruin of shattered pews and warped hymnals. There, the pews were full. Shadowed figures sat motionless, singing without mouths. The sound was pure, too pure, like air being forced through the holes of an empty skull. He covered his ears and whispered, "What do you want from me?" And the voices stopped. Only one figure remained. It raised its head, and in that eyeless face, Elias saw himself. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time melted in the fever of guilt. He stopped leaving the house. The servants had fled. The mirror, the photographs, the hymns, all were part of the same machinery, winding him tighter toward confession. He finally opened his father's ledgers. Inside were lists, not of slaves, but of purchases. Human lives reduced to numbers. Each entry signed with the same symbol carved beneath the mirror, a spiral drawn in ash. At the last page, his father's handwriting faltered, and the ink trailed off mid-sentence. "She will come for the last of us, not to punish, but to make us remember." Elias closed the book. The walls seemed to breathe around him. Remember what? Then, softly, from the cellar, came the sound of someone breathing back. Elias woke to the scent of burning oil. The lantern he'd left cold on the desk was lit, yet no one else was in the house. It illuminated the cellar door. The light trembled, as though something below was breathing in rhythm with the flame. He tried to speak, but his throat ached, raw from nights of silent screams. In the flicker of light, he saw the spiral symbol traced on the cellar door in soot. It wasn't ink. It was fresh, damp. When he reached out to wipe it away, the wood felt warm, like flesh remembering touch. He descended. The steps creaked, but the sound didn't echo. It was swallowed, absorbed by the air. The mirror still stood there, cracked but luminous. Only now, it reflected the present, the cellar exactly as it was, except for one thing. In the reflection, a woman stood beside him. She didn't move. She only looked toward the wall where the bricks discolored in the shape of a door long sealed. And then, from behind that wall, came the faintest sound, not a moan, not a cry, but the rhythm of something brushing stone. He pressed his ear against it. It whispered back a single word he couldn't deny. Remember. He found a chisel and began to dig. Dust filled his lungs. Time unraveled. Every strike of metal on brick sounded like a heartbeat. Behind the wall was a hollow space, small, no larger than a coffin. Inside lay a single wooden chair, bound with rope. And on it, a stain so deep it had turned the wood black. He stepped back, gasping. Then, from somewhere unseen, the voice of his father, calm, commanding, like a sermon. She confessed, it said. We had to make her forget herself. Elias turned toward the mirror. The reflection now showed the same chair, but occupied, and the woman's head slowly lifted toward him. He ran, but the house wouldn't let him go. Every hallway curved back into the cellar. Every door led to the same room. The mirror multiplied, appearing in corners, behind curtains, inside the glass of framed portraits. Each reflection showed a different version of himself. One older, one younger, one wearing his father's clothes. He shouted into the glass, demanding to know who she was. And the mirrors answered in chorus, his own voice layered upon itself. You bought what your blood once sold. You freed nothing. You returned her to the house. He dropped the lantern. It didn't shatter. It simply went dark, swallowed whole by shadow. The plantation began to change. The walls pulsed faintly, as though something behind them had begun to breathe. Windows fogged from within. Portraits wept through their varnish. The spiral symbol reappeared everywhere, painted, carved, burned. Elias wandered through the parlor, whispering apologies to no one. The air tasted of earth and copper. In the stillness, he understood. The house wasn't haunted by the woman. It was the woman, rebuilt from her suffering, given form through memory, rage, and the guilt of generations. When he whispered her name, it wasn't to summon her, it was to release her. And as he spoke it, the house exhaled. At dawn, light finally touched the house for the first time in weeks. Yet the walls still seemed to breathe. Elias followed the spiral markings through the corridors. Each curve led him closer to the parlor, where the floorboards bowed inward, forming a shallow pit. He realized the spiral was a map, a path inward, toward the heart of what had been denied. When he stepped into the pit, the air thickened, vibrating softly, like a throat preparing to speak. He fell to his knees. In the stillness, he heard every echo of his lineage, the shouts, the silences, the bargains, the prayers. And beneath them all, a quieter sound, a woman's breath, slow and patient, waiting centuries for someone to finally listen. The house filled with whispers, not voices of ghosts, but memories resurrected. He saw flashes, the auction block, the gavel striking, the woman's eyes defiant and unbroken. No one had bid, not because she was cursed, but because she had refused to break. The plantation's curse wasn't her vengeance. It was their denial of her humanity. Elias fell to the ground, trembling. His hands sank into the floorboards, which felt warm, pulsing with something alive. He whispered, "I remember." And at that moment, the house sighed, a long, weary exhalation, as if centuries of silence had found release through him. Cracks split the walls like veins bursting beneath the skin. The mirrors shattered, but instead of shards, they released light, pale, soft, and weightless. The portraits melted back into blank canvas. The spiral symbols glowed faintly, then dimmed, as though the story had finally finished telling itself. Elias stumbled into the field behind the plantation. The sun rose weakly over the cypress trees, painting everything gold. When he turned back, the house was collapsing, not violently, but gently, folding inward like a dying breath. And in its place, nothing but dust, and the faint impression of a woman's silhouette traced in the morning dew. Seasons changed. Grass grew over the ruins. Locals avoided the land, claiming they could still hear a woman humming in the wind. Elias disappeared from records. Only his journal remained, discovered decades later, its final pages stained with earth. The last entry read, "I thought she wanted revenge, but she only wanted her story told. I was her last witness, and the last of us to remember." No one ever built on that land again. The soil refused foundations. The earth itself seemed to guard what had finally been set free. Today, the plantation exists only in rumor, a name erased from maps, yet whispered in sermons and songs. Some say the woman was never a ghost at all, but a memory given shape, a fragment of truth that refused burial. And if you stand on that field at dawn, when the fog curls low and the air tastes of iron, you may hear a single breath behind you, not of threat, but of endurance. The land remembers, and the question remains, passed like a curse through every generation that tries to forget. What happens when the sins we inherit finally learn to speak?